Ian Murray.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have great pleasure in moving Amendments E and F on the order paper in my name and that of my friends, my honourable friends and my right honourable friends. Can I firstly just say to the member for Aberdeen South, the reason I did make the interventions on him during his speech, which I thought was I didn't agree with a word that he said in his speech, but I thought it was a good speech, and I know he and I have always disagreed on the European Union, and we both respect each other's position for doing that. I'm very much a Member of Parliament, an elected member who wishes to stay in the EU. I'm very much pro-European Union. I know he's very much anti-European Union, but I do have to say to the honourable gentleman that the incoherence of the two arguments that he makes, that we can leave the single market and the customs union and the European Union and have a frictionless, seamless, invisible border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, when he made the arguments during the Scottish independence referendum that leaving the UK single market would mean a hard border in goods, services and the movement of people, is completely intellectually incoherent. And I think he does the issue of fighting against the scourge of independence in Scotland no good by making these contradictory arguments. And I do say to him as someone to merely highlight the point that many of the arguments that our colleagues in the Scottish National Party make about staying in the European Union and working with our closest colleagues and neighbours with regards to trade, goods and free movement of people is completely contrary as well to the arguments for coming out of the UK single market. So these positions are contradictory, and I do warn politicians that when they play with fire, they do tend to get burnt. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman. May I bring him back to Amendment E, which, as he says, he is the lead signatory. It does, of course, close off options and prevents us from imposing any tariffs on goods from the EU. His front-bench spokesman described such closing off options as pathological in his speech. Now, the honourable gentleman always strikes me as being a very nice chap. Will he share my concern that his own front-bench thinks that Amendment E is pathological?
Well, I'm grateful for the intervention. Indeed, I was anticipating it, just not quite as early in my contribution as that. But I do say to the honourable gentleman, do I agree and share his compliments? He's one of the nicest gentlemen in this House as well. And if I could just read out the line, if I can find it, because it was much later in my contribution, from the Labour Party's position with regards to the customs union. It quite clearly, our position is, and I quote, to have tariff-free access to the European Union throughout the transition period, and with the added option of the UK staying in the customs union. So that's the position of our front bench, one that's perfectly clear and chimes perfectly well with my amendments E and F to this Ways and Means bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, can I also pay tribute to the honourable member for Aberdeen North? I'm disappointed her amendments weren't selected in this position. She's done a lot of work on bringing us to this place with regards to the Ways and Means petition in front of us, and I think that the arguments that we'll have very much chime with the fact that we both want to stay within the single market and the customs union, not from any ideological perspective, but we know that the businesses of Aberdeen North and the businesses of Aberdeen South require for us to do that. It's impossible to suggest that the United Kingdom should have exactly the same benefits of the single market and the customs union, have a frictionless border, have tariff-free access, and then not keep the customs union and the single market on the table. It just does not make sense. And I know the Minister, in the gallant... Happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way. He's making a very powerful case. Often it's said that sometimes we just need to simplify in this place. If it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it's a duck. If everything the government is saying they want looks like, sounds like the customs union and the single market, why on earth are we wasting time debating other things?
Well, I'm tempted, Mr Deputy Speaker, to say it's because they're all quackers, but I'm sure that wouldn't go down very well in the Chamber. Indeed, you know, I gave up on the dad jokes some time ago, but my honourable friend is right. That it is indeed the case that the government are actually arguing for the single market and the customs union, but don't want the single market and the customs union. And I think that's why the customs union bill, which we will see tomorrow, will show quite clearly that the government are hell-bent in the negotiations with the European Union to take us off a cliff edge, and a no deal would be probably their preferred option with regards to that, and that's what they're promoting with this Ways and Means resolution. I'm happy to give way.
Would my honourable friend be intrigued to know that apparently a former minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union plans to make a speech tomorrow arguing just for that proposal, and that in fact we should abandon all plans, all trade talks, and in fact move ahead onto a no-deal WTO Brexit?
Well, if that is indeed the case, the one thing that will fall from that speech is that anybody who's surprised that the Minister makes that speech has indeed not been listening to the debate to date, because it seems that the whole thrust of this government's negotiating position so far has been that we should just walk away. A no deal would be the best deal to have. And as my honourable friend from Lewisham, he said to the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's questions not long ago that the Prime Minister is in thrall to the extreme right-wing Brexiteers of the Conservative Party, and that's dictating their policy on this. And you can see from the debate we've already had this evening that is indeed dictating their policy. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. It's a very important point he makes. Should there be a no deal, you've got to think about investment in this country, because a lot of international companies have invested in this country with the option of being able to trade in Europe. That could have very serious consequences, particularly for industry in particular.
It does, and I'll come on to more of these arguments a little bit later on, but indeed the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, of which I'm a member, visited the border regions in Ireland and Northern Ireland just last week. And one of the key concerns from businesses who employ many thousands of workers on either side of the border was they use the UK as the transit into the European Union. We are the landing strip for all of the goods that they export through the United Kingdom into the European Union, because it's the fastest possible way of doing it. The alternatives are not suitable for their businesses, and that will be exactly the same for businesses in Coventry, for businesses in Aberdeen, for businesses in Edinburgh South, and indeed the honourable gentleman from Aberdeen South that spoke so eloquently about the Scotch whisky industry. We all defend and champion the Scottish whisky industry, but one of the key things is they need easy access to the markets in which they sell their products, and they too are championing for as close a deal with the customs union as possible. I have to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He mentions the Scotch whisky industry. Of course, he will be aware that the finest Scotch whisky in the world is sold in ceramic bottles made in my constituency. and exiting the European Union without a proper trade deal will see not only the price of the whisky go up, but also the cost of the bottle, which puts jobs in my constituency under threat. What would he make of the government's proposal so far for market trade remedies?
Absolutely, and I'm glad my honourable friend from Stoke has made that particular point, because the Scotch whisky industry is not just a Scottish industry. It's a UK-wide industry where bottling happens, where packaging happens, delivery companies, and this whole supply chain is a UK supply chain. So if you disturb the main driver of that supply chain, which is indeed the whisky coming out of Scotland, you certainly disturb potentially the jobs in your constituency. I have to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And much as I enjoy a decent malt whisky, the impact of leaving the customs union would be far greater, of course. And if we take into account the agricultural industry, the defence industry, aerospace, automotive, it's quite clear that the complex supply chains that we have at the moment in an integrated European Union marketplace could severely disrupt the UK economy if we don't get this right.
And that's why this Ways and Means motion, the three motions we've got in front of us tonight, and indeed the customs bill when it comes forward, and indeed the trade bill, and indeed the EU withdrawal bill, are so important. And that brings me to one of the key points of why I brought these amendments. Happy to...
Before he moves off the Scotch whisky element, I just wonder whether he'd like to comment on the fact that recently several of us were in Peru, and we asked, and the Peruvian ministers asked us, the British ambassador what we would want out of a new free trade deal with Peru after our leaving Brexit. And the Peruvians said immediately, well, we know what we want, and that is we want all Scotch whisky to be made in Peru and not to be made in Scotland, or at least 40% of it, or at least bottled in Peru, which rather undermines the whole argument that was made by the honourable member for Aberdeen South earlier, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that my honourable friend takes me down a road that the Deputy Speaker may not want to take me down. But let me just tiptoe to the start of that road, if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, in terms of the issue around Scotch whisky, because not only does the EU give it solid legal protection, but it also means that you have to have the Scotch whisky made in Scotland. And indeed, my honourable friend from Stoke has already highlighted the fact that it's a supply chain across the United Kingdom, and we will be competing with markets that are much, much cheaper to bottle, to package, to produce. And not just with Scotch whisky, but a whole host of other manufacturing items that this country makes so much money out of. And indeed, it's money that pays for our public services, and it's the jobs that keep our people employed. And just while I'm on that particular particular issue. I don't know if the Minister would be able to tell us what representation he's making in these talks to leave the European Union about defending some of the big industries like aerospace, like automotives, like the food and drink industry that's underpinned by the Scotch whisky industry in Scotland, and what representations he's going to make, because it was quite clear in the 20 minutes or so that the Minister spoke that he said, in answers to lots of questions from my honourable and right honourable friends, that HMRC will need more resources, Customs will need more resources, everybody will need more resources, but can't tell us how much they will require, why they will require them, when they will get them, and whether or not that will actually be enough. It's all easy. It's very easy to talk as a government minister in platitudes, but actually we need solid answers as to how many people this will mean, how many it will require, and what the consequences that will mean for the public purse. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way. Is he as surprised as I am that there are members opposite who seem to be quite content with recruiting 3,000 to 5,000 more people for HMRC? As I understand it at the weekend, 1,200 people to work in the Home Office, many of them incidentally from the EU because they're short of staff. Wasn't this about getting rid of red tape? Yet it seems as though the government are willing to invest huge amounts in creating a huge amount more red tape.
Well, that is indeed a key argument, and a secondary argument to the one I've been making about the government saying quite clearly that we want everything to be as close as possible. We want it to be frictionless. We want it to be as close to the customs union as we currently have. Well, if you want to be, as my honourable friend from Walthamstow has said, if it walks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck. And I don't understand, and I've never understood the government's position of taking the single market and the customs union off the table. Whether or not you want to argue if they're positive or negative, good for the country, bad for the country, they immediately took those two things off the table, which meant the negotiating position at the very start was diminished, and diminished for all the reasons that my honourable friend has just mentioned. I'm happy to give it.
I wonder whether he's aware that, well, he probably isn't because I haven't told him yet, but that a couple of weeks ago I asked the Secretary of State for leaving for Brexit whether the Canadian deal, free trade agreement, would be a good deal for Britain, the Canadian deal with the EU. And he said no, because it wouldn't be as good a deal as the customs union. It would leave us worse off. Well, I cannot see how one could possibly, therefore, argue that one should automatically discount staying in the customs union.
Well, that is indeed the case, and the deal that the EU has done with Canada in terms of CETA has been held up as a blueprint for what world trade agreement should look like in the future, and indeed we look as if we're just about to walk away from it because we want something better. If there was something better, I'm sure Canada and the EU would have negotiated that, and indeed I was aware of the question he was going to ask because I was sitting behind him when he posed that question to the Secretary of State during Brexit questions, so I thank him for that particular intervention. Can I just say, Mr Deputy Speaker, the three reasons why I brought these amendments. The first one chimes very much with my honourable friend, the member for Bootle, who moved the opposition to the Ways and Means resolution from the front bench, and that is about Parliament having a say. Now, taking back control became the strapline of the Leave campaign during the EU referendum, and if taking back control is truly what we wish to do, and I think that's what the public wish us to do as well, then taking back control should surely mean taking back control for this Parliament. And whether it be the EU withdrawal bill that's going through the House at the moment, or whether it be these Ways and Means resolutions, or indeed we will see it in the Customs Bill no doubt when that's published, that ministers will hold this power to do anything they want, carte blanche, with trade, with tariffs, with immigration, with removing ourselves from the EEA, with removing ourselves from the Customs Union, without any recourse at all to this House. And what we've seen over the last 6 weeks or so, with the government championing a meaningful vote, whatever a meaningful vote would mean, I think the vote will neither be meaningful or is unlikely to even be a vote. And we've seen the government from one side to the next, 2 days, one day is never the same as the next in terms of what that actually means, and indeed had given 3 clarities in one day just a couple of weeks ago, with the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union and indeed the Prime Minister saying contradictory things, and then their spokespeople having to correct what they had said, and they were both incorrect when they corrected it. So we need slightly greater clarity from the government about what they want to do, rather than platitudes from the Minister. And indeed we've had Lord Callanan in the House of Lords in the other place making 2 correcting statements to what he said about Article 50 in the other place just a few weeks ago. So we do need to have some answers to these questions. This is why we, on this side of the House, are very doubtful of the fact that we can trust the government just to, we'll take the power, we may not use it, we may use it, we need to use it, we need to have it in case we want to use it, but trust us, everything will be fine. Unfortunately, you have to earn that trust, and I think the opposition in this Parliament has shown quite clearly, or been told quite clearly, that we can't trust this government to do things properly on our behalf because they're proven not to have been able to do so. So the first one is not hoarding that power with ministers, but giving this Parliament a say if we truly want to take back control. And that leads on to my second point. Nobody in this House, when we get to the end of this process, will ever have voted on leaving the Customs Union. Nobody will ever have voted on leaving the single market. Nobody will ever have voted on leaving the EEA. What the people of this country voted for was to leave the European Union. Now, when you start working through the process and seeing how complicated it is, you see how difficult it can be for businesses, you can see all the challenges and barriers and hurdles that are put in place, it's quite clear that nothing can be as good as what we've got at the moment. Whatever happens, there will be losers, and nobody in this process voted to be poorer. And that's why I think that bringing this Ways and Means motion without excluding tariffs to the European Union is the wrong one to bring, because nobody has yet voted for us to leave the Customs Union. And the Customs Union is vitally important to this country, not just in terms of businesses on the UK mainland, but I'll come on to some comments about the island of Ireland very shortly as well. And the third thing, and this is the main thing I think why this Ways and Means motion should be defeated or at least amended with my amendments E and F, is quite clear that the government are preparing for no deal. We know they're preparing for no deal because my honourable friend from South Cardiff and Penarth has said already that a Brexit minister will be making a speech, a former minister will be making a speech tomorrow saying the government should be persuaded to prepare for no deal. It seems that the talks are stalling, it seems that the clock is still ticking and we seem to be no further forward. The Brexit Secretary seems to have, and certainly the Foreign Secretary seems to have, this attitude that we've wrapped ourselves in a Union Jack, we will ride the waves like Rule Britannia used to, and everyone will listen to us, and that sort of 19th century British arrogance that created many of the problems that we have around the world at the moment. And I think we should be looking quite clearly at the fact that everything the government is putting through this House at the moment is to put it through on the basis of a preparation for no deal, which would be utterly disastrous for this country. And let me tell you why it would be disastrous and why I brought those amendments. Well, I'm very grateful to Mr Speaker for selecting the amendments to this motion tonight. As the economic impact of the Customs Union, we've heard many people in the Chamber already talking about that economic impact. Our annual goods trade with other countries within the Customs Union is £466 billion. Leaving the Customs Union would cost, as been estimated, £25 billion every year since 2030. Now, if the opposition was bringing a proposal to this House that the government had to consider that cost £500 billion and £25 billion every year, the word bankruptcy would be coming out of the Minister's mouth every second minute, because it would be irresponsible for us to do that, and that's what's being proposed with the Customs Bill and this particular motion that's forward this evening. The cost of new tariffs alone could be at least £4.5 billion a year for UK exports, according to detailed research that's already been done. And analysis by HMRC suggests that new customs checks could increase the cost of imported goods by up to 24%. That's HMRC suggesting that new customs checks could do that. We've already had reports that there will be 17-mile tailbacks at ports across the United Kingdom. And I just wonder if the Minister could remember when we had the strike from French customs and how long those customs queues became very, very quickly indeed. The impact on those local communities alone was devastating, let alone the perishable goods that were sitting in trucks. And it's okay for the Minister to, I'll just finish this point, but it's okay for the Minister to suggest that we'll have so many customs borders checks, we will be pushing things through as quickly as possible. But actually, the way that you resolve this position is to stay in the Customs Union.
The humble bottle of fabric conditioner crosses the border of a member state 4 times in the process of its manufacture. Imagine how many times the components that make up a Rolls-Royce jet engine cross the border, thousands of times. On that basis, how can this country's economy afford to even think about leaving the Customs Union?
I'm grateful that my honourable friend makes that particular point, but if I was the Minister and you just made that point to me, I would just say it'll be okay. We want something that's as close to the customs union as possible. It will be frictionless. It will only take seconds. We've got new technologies without spelling out what they are, how they'll work, how a company like Rolls-Royce, who are exporting, importing goods and parts all the time, will actually operate. And we just seem to be having to take this on trust. Well, many of the businesses around the country, they need the certainty. They're making decisions very shortly about the years ahead. I'm happy to give way.
For giving way, and further to the point that my honourable friend from Penistone and Stockbridge just raised. In fact, Simon Hemmings, who's one of the chief negotiators for Rolls-Royce at their manufacturing site in Derby, told the FT, if we are not in the customs union, there will be job losses. You couldn't have clearer than that.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, because I did say earlier on that nobody voted in the European Union referendum to be poorer. And it seems to me that all the analysis shows that already. In fact, I would be delighted if the Minister wants to intervene on me now, if he can tell me any analysis that's been done internally, externally or otherwise, from any other government in the world, from any government department, from any country, from any think tank, from any organisation, from any business organisation, from any individual business. I'll let him intervene on me now. I know he's listening, he's just pretending to ignore me. I'll let him intervene on me now and tell me any organisation that said that this process with what the government is offering will make the country better off. Absolutely none. The silence is deafening. Not even the producers of our microphones will make more money, Mr Deputy Speaker, because the Minister refuses to even use it to tell us. Any organisation, just one organisation who says will even be remotely similar in this process of leaving the European Union, the answer is clearly none. And that's why this government is on the wrong track, and that's why this government is gambling everything, the family silver and everything, on a no-deal scenario. Let me just continue, Mr Deputy Speaker, with regards to the customs union and the impact that that will have. I just want to take some sectors, because my honourable friend mentioned automotives earlier on. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the SMMT, the organisation that we trust as parliamentarians when they send us briefings for budgets and for bills that are going through this House. I always read the SMMT with great interest, because they are the knowledge in terms of motor manufacturing. They have said that WTO rules, if we go off the cliff, would see 10% tariffs on vehicles and an average 4.5% tariff on car components. Now, people know these figures because they've been repeated in this House ad nauseum. But that would push the cost of an average car up by £1,500. We've already had figures recently that showed new car manufacturing and car sales is dropping quite dramatically. And I think if people were looking at whether or not they were to choose to buy a new car with an additional £1,500, then they would not do so. And I appreciate the Minister doesn't agree with that, but I'm more likely to believe the SMMT with regards to the figures they're producing than the government coming to the dispatch box and saying, don't worry, everything will be all right on the night, without giving us any detail at all about how that will possibly operate in the context of no customs union and no customs arrangement. I'm happy to know.
Generous to giving way. So he is happy with a situation by which, for all time, we are locked in a situation where we can never, ever be allowed to make a free trade deal with a country or a bloc or anybody outside the EU. So we are locked into a body with a declining share of trade, and we are locking ourselves out of free trade deals with the growing markets in Asia and America. He's happy with that.
Honourable Gentleman, I'm happy with the intervention. I'm delighted with the intervention because it allows me to say three things. Firstly, the reason that the Scotch whisky industry is doing so well is partly because of EU free trade agreements, particularly with countries like South Korea. The second thing is we're already in 57 free trade agreements. And the third thing I would say to the honourable gentleman is his government have failed wholeheartedly to even start to negotiate one free trade agreement. All the bluff and bluster about being at fronts of queues, about them happening easily, about us seamlessly going into these wonderful free trade agreements all over the world would be great. And I do say to the honourable gentleman, his intervention completely contradicts his first intervention, because if he votes for my amendment tonight and we end up on WTO rules and we end up not having any tariffs with the European Union, we'll have tariffs with no one, and we can ride the waves as Rule Britannia and set up more than 57 free trade agreements with every country who's banging at our door to do trade with us. I just think the honourable gentleman is not listening to his Foreign Secretary or the Trade Secretary when they say that this is becoming much, much more difficult, and free trade agreements with all these countries that he wishes to have more than 57 are just going to appear low-hanging fruit from this magic money tree that the government seems to always produce. I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way once again, and to pick up on the point from the honourable gentleman opposite. Of course, free trade is to be welcomed, but in certain sectors, such as the ceramic industry, what we actually need is protections against illegal dumping of tiles and whiteware, which affects our industry and puts our jobs at risk. So while the opposition may be talking about unilateral free trade and making our markets open, what that will do in some sectors is harm jobs, harms employment, and puts my constituents in a poorer position.
Absolutely, and I think illegal dumping is something I think this House should come back to and debate at length, because I think it's one of the key issues around what may happen when we leave the European Union, because we don't have that bloc to defend us. And if I can just say, Mr Deputy Speaker, in response to the first part of his intervention in terms of free trade, I have a great idea of how we can advance free trade in this country. We could have a customs union and we could have a single market, and that would certainly advance free trade, wouldn't it? Or we could come out of it and end up in a situation whereby we've now got 57 free trade agreements, but the honourable gentleman decides that we should come out and indeed have none. Mr Deputy Speaker, I had a whole list of sectors I wish to go through, but I won't in the interest of time. So let me very briefly just mention 2 or 3 of the very big ones who've raised concerns. Let me look at pharmaceuticals, one of the key areas that drives a lot of our corporation tax, a lot of our tax into the public purse in this country. The Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries, the ABPI, has called for free trade with the EU equivalent to those of a full member of the Customs Union. So again, I pose the question to the Treasury bench and to indeed the Minister who opened this particular debate: how is he going to ensure that the pharmaceutical industry, an industry that I would rather believe than the Government Minister, an industry that has brought so much economically to this country in terms of jobs and growth, how am I supposed to believe the Minister or the pharmaceutical industry? And they say they want free trade, let me just finish this point, I'll give way, equivalent to those of a full member of the Customs Union. Well, the Government have ruled that out tonight. They'll rule that out tonight when they pass this motion. So what's the Minister going to say to the pharmaceutical industry, who say they need that to be able to trade as they are at the moment? I'm happy to give way.
Thank him for giving way. Would he like to speculate on what contribution the departure today of the European Medicines Agency to Amsterdam has made to our pharmaceutical industry?
Well, it's jobs, isn't it? It's jobs, 900 jobs. And maybe even more than 900 jobs when you think about the knock-on effect. So the Government has just given up 900 jobs. That's the start. That's the tip of the iceberg. If the pharmaceutical industry can't get equivalence to the current customs union, then how many jobs may go in the pharmaceutical industry? And before everybody says, oh, you're just a Ramona, well, actually, if being a Ramona means I'm defending the jobs of the people in my constituency and the people of this country, then I'll buy a badge. If maybe the honourable gentleman, instead of chuntering from over there, could perhaps get me a badge, and I'll say I'm a very proud Ramona, because a proud Ramona means jobs, rather than giving up on jobs in this country. I have to give way.
I'm loath to interrupt this excellent speech by the honourable member. I'm slightly concerned, though, that he keeps talking about the views of experts. We know that the other side are not keen on the views of experts. Does he think that they might listen this time?
Ooh. Well, I think I can answer the honourable lady's intervention in one word, and the one word being no, because they quite clearly aren't going to listen to the experts on these particular issues. And what they've done in this country, of course, is they've sown the seed of doubt that none of us should listen to experts. And we're now in a position whereby the country is going to be much diminished as a result. 2 more sectors, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I may. The chemicals sector. Again, one of the key drivers of the UK economy. We've got a great chemical sector. It's one of the key chemical sectors across the European Union. Have said, and I quote, the best way to guarantee no adverse disruption to business and trade and to guarantee only one adjustment before reaching a final agreement with the EU is to seek to retain our existing membership of the single market and indeed the customs union. So we've got the automotive sector, the one that we all trust. We've got the pharmaceutical sector. We've now got the chemistries, the chemical sector. And the Minister's just come to the dispatchment and says, don't worry, we'll put more people in place to help all this along. Well, can I suggest the customs union might be an answer to this particular issue? Let me finish with the sectors in terms of the shipping sector, the very sector that takes the goods from these islands to the continent. The UK shipping sector have warned that the UK is facing, and I quote, an absolute catastrophe if it does not sort out a frictionless and seamless border at Dover and other ports. Now, we know the Government keeps talking about a frictionless and seamless border, but can't tell us what that actually means. Can I suggest that the best way to maintain or to enhance the border, to make it frictionless, to make it seamless, and to make it operate as a single market would be to maintain our status in the customs union? Because if we were starting from scratch with a blank sheet of paper to determine what's the best way for an island nation to trade with other nations, it would be to have a customs union with those nations, whereby you didn't need to use the word frictionless, because there'd be absolutely no friction at all and would be completely seamless. And the best way to highlight how seamless and how frictionless a single market and a customs union can operate is to look at the markets between Scotland, Wales and England. Completely seamless across the border, completely free market, completely single market, completely customs free. And I know the Secretary of State for the Environment has joined us, and I'm delighted he has, because he argued, along with me, and I said this to his honourable friend from Aberdeen South, that one of the key opposition arguments to an independent Scotland was not to have a border at Berwick. Now he's arguing the opposite with Northern Ireland and the island of Islands, and it's completely contradictory, and he can't tell us how it's going to be resolved. So how could that not have been resolved in the Scottish context? It's completely and utterly contradictory for the honourable gentleman to have made those arguments in the Scottish independence referendum context, but making contrary arguments now. As a member of the Customs Union, the UK is part of those preferential trade agreements, the trade agreements that we just want to walk away from and make our own. And outside the Customs Union, it's likely that the UK would need to renegotiate many, if not all, of those agreements with all people who would now become third parties. And it's not as easy as just rolling over these agreements as the government seem to want to do. I'm conscious of time, Mr Deputy Speaker, so let me just move on a little bit, because I want to talk about Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I know the government don't like to hear these arguments because they don't have any answers to them, but I think it's important for us to highlight them in this House, and if they can only give the limited amount of time for the EU withdrawal bill, then we may as well rehearse some of the arguments in the Ways and Means resolution that's been brought to this House. We have till 10 o'clock after all. If the honourable gentleman wants to intervene and waste time as well, he's more than welcome to do that. We've already talked about the massive queues at our ports, at our airports, at our rail terminals, but I do want to talk a little bit about Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The Foreign Affairs Committee visited Dublin and the border on Thursday and Friday of last week to look at the consequences of us leaving the European Union. And again, I say to the Minister, if he wants to come to the dispatch box and tell me any organisation in either Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland that thinks that Brexit's going to be good for the islands of Ireland, then please do so, because I didn't hear any. I'm unlikely to hear any. Indeed, the only two people I heard supporting our withdrawal from the customs union and the single market in the context of the Isles of Ireland were indeed the two Brexiteers who are on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Nobody else made those arguments, and indeed some of the words that were used were catastrophic, irreconcilable, unsolvable, and I just can't understand how the Minister can bring these kinds of resolutions to this House to pave the way for major bills that are going to go through this House without having the basic answers to these questions, without using just meaningless phrases like frictionless and seamless. And I've got a real concern for this document, which is the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, underpinned by the European Union, underpinned by a seamless border, underpinned by a single market in the island of Ireland, and it's impossible, almost impossible, for the government to reconcile them wanting no borders, frictionless and seamless trade, with the route they're going down with a no-deal Brexit. I got another suggestion. In fact, the Minister might recognise the suggestion. The way to have a seamless and frictionless border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is indeed, may I suggest, the customs union, because that would mean that trade in goods could go across the border unfettered, seamless, and I may even push it to frictionless, is what the government have been saying all along. We travelled from Cavan County Council, who hosted us on Thursday evening, to drive onto the motorway back to Dublin. It's about 4.5 miles. We were in the minibus. We crossed the border 7 times. 7 times. Just to go that very short distance. This is irreconcilable, and many people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland who spoke to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee last week, and I'm sure the Minister will be pleased to read the conclusions of that when it is actually published by the committee, is that it's intellectually incoherent to argue that you can have no border whilst requiring a border. You can't have frictionless and seamless trade while having to check goods. You can't have a border at the sea level when you're trying to make sure that the Good Friday Agreement is maintained. And former President Mary McAleese spoke to us in great depth about the passion for this Good Friday Agreement. And I do say to the Minister and the Government, and I say this in all seriousness, they ruin this agreement at their peril. The Good Friday Agreement is something that everyone should be incredibly proud of. And the way in which the Government are going about the Brexit negotiations, the way in which they are treating the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the way in which they are fooling the public that you can have everything and not have everything is indeed wrong. And Michelle Barnier, the chief negotiator, who we all know so well now, has said to the Government, in particular to this issue of Ireland, that they can't have their cake and eat it. So something is going to have to give, and I say to the Minister that that's why I brought these amendments, because he has to think very seriously about that particular physical border. Mr Deputy Speaker, I will conclude just by saying a little bit about the Labour Party's position. I think the Labour Party's position is indeed right on this issue. It's written into the Labour Party's position in the documents that we have here, that we want to stay, if possible, in the Customs Union. I agree with the amendments from my honourable friend from Boothold, who brought forward the amendments about scrutiny in this place. These are amendments that we should always be pushing, because the Government are saying to take back control, but indeed are not giving control to this particular Parliament. And all the issues around Ireland, around trade, around tariffs, around what happens in the future, around jobs, around the borders, around tailbacks at customs, can all be resolved by the United Kingdom at least leaving on the table, regardless of whether or not you agree with them or you don't agree with them, leaving on the table the possibility of being members of the single market and the customs union. That would take away all of these particular concerns. And when we get to the end of this process, meaningful vote or no meaningful vote in this place, the Minister and his government will know that when the jobs start leaving this country, when borders start going up, when customs becomes more difficult, when trade becomes much more difficult, when public services become much more difficult to fund, when debt rises and deficit rises, that his government have let the people down by not telling them the truth about the consequences of coming out the single market and the customs union. And that's why I move these amendments, and I hope many of my honourable friends, right honourable friends, will join me in the lobbies this evening.